For several years, Mark believed he was doing everything the right way. Nothing about his financial life looked reckless. He worked a stable job, paid his bills on time, and kept a portion of every paycheck in a savings account. It wasn't an extraordinary system, but it worked well enough to keep him moving forward. By the time he turned 30, the balance in that account had slowly grown to a little over $30,000. That number didn't make him wealthy. In most cities, it barely covered a year of basic living expenses. Still, it represented something important: consistency. Every month, that balance had grown a little larger, and every month, the same quiet sense of progress followed. People rarely talk about that kind of progress because it isn't dramatic. It happens quietly, almost invisibly. Years pass, small deposits accumulate, and one day, you look at the account and realize a foundation has been built. Mark thought that foundation made him safe. Like many people with stable routines, he assumed the biggest financial risks belonged to gamblers, reckless investors, or people chasing fast money. His life didn't look anything like that. He had no interest in speculation, no fascination with risky investments, and no desire to chase trends that promised quick returns. From his perspective, the system was simple. Keep working, keep saving, and over time, the numbers would continue to grow. For a long time, that assumption appeared to be correct. Then a conversation changed the direction of everything. It started on a quiet Thursday evening. Mark had agreed to meet an old friend for dinner after work. They had known each other for years, long before careers and responsibilities had pulled their lives in different directions. The conversation began like most casual reunions do: work updates, family news, small observations about how quickly time had passed. At some point, the topic shifted toward money, which often happens once people reach their late 20s and early 30s. That was when his friend mentioned a new business idea. The proposal sounded straightforward at first. A small logistics company was expanding operations and needed additional equipment. Instead of going through complicated financing, the owner was looking for a personal loan arrangement with someone he trusted. The structure was simple: a fixed repayment schedule, a modest interest rate, and written agreements outlining the terms. Mark listened carefully, asking questions in the calm, analytical way people do when they believe they're evaluating something responsibly. The numbers looked reasonable. The repayment timeline wasn't aggressive, and the interest offered was noticeably better than what his savings account produced each year. His money, sitting quietly in the bank, earned almost nothing. Moving part of it into a structured loan seemed like a smarter use of the same capital. That logic felt sensible. When people hear about financial mistakes, they often imagine moments driven by impulse or desperation. The reality is usually more ordinary. Many bad decisions begin inside conversations that sound practical and well-intentioned. Mark didn't feel pressured to act immediately. He took several days to think about it. During that time, he reviewed the documents his friend had shared, looked at the repayment schedule, and even searched online for general advice about private lending. None of the information he found suggested obvious danger. Informal lending between acquaintances was not unusual. As long as expectations were clear and both parties agreed on written terms, it could function like any other small financial arrangement. That explanation made the decision feel manageable. Eventually, he agreed to provide $15,000 from his savings. The amount represented roughly half of what he had accumulated over several years. Sending that money away felt uncomfortable for a brief moment, but the discomfort faded quickly once the transfer was complete and the repayment agreement was signed. From his perspective, the situation had several advantages. His friend received the capital needed to grow the business, and Mark earned interest that was better than what the bank offered. The first payment arrived exactly on schedule. A month later, the second payment appeared as well. Those early confirmations strengthened his confidence in the arrangement. The system was working exactly as described, and the small interest deposits felt like quiet proof that he had made a thoughtful decision. For the next few months, everything continued according to the plan. The payments weren't large, but they were consistent. Each one reinforced the belief that the arrangement had been a reasonable use of money that would otherwise remain idle. That belief made it easier to stop thinking about the risk entirely. Financial problems rarely appear at the beginning of a situation. They develop gradually, usually after a long stretch of normalcy that convinces everyone involved that the system is stable. Mark's attention returned to his daily routine. Work filled most of his week, and the steady rhythm of life made the loan feel less like a major financial decision and more like a background detail. Then the payment schedule changed. The message arrived late one evening, several days after the next installment was expected. His friend explained that a large client had delayed a shipment, temporarily affecting the company's cash flow. The delay was described as short-term and manageable. One payment might arrive a week late, but the schedule would return to normal shortly afterward. Situations like this are common in small businesses. Cash flow can shift unpredictably even when operations are healthy. Mark understood that explanation. He didn't feel alarmed. A single delay didn't seem significant, especially when the previous payments had arrived exactly on time. Businesses occasionally experience small disruptions, and the tone of the message suggested that everything remained under control. A few days later, the payment arrived. The delay was short, the explanation sounded reasonable, and the agreement continued. At that point, nothing looked especially dangerous. The loan still appeared structured, documented, and manageable. Mark had no reason to believe the decision would eventually erase a large portion of the savings he had spent years building. From the outside, the situation looked like a normal financial arrangement between two adults who trusted each other. That was precisely what made the next phase difficult to recognize. Because the problem didn't begin with a dramatic collapse or a sudden disappearance of money. It developed slowly, inside small changes that seemed temporary at first. And by the time those changes started forming a pattern, the foundation Mark believed he had built was already beginning to weaken. The first signs of trouble were subtle. The late payment that seemed temporary at first slowly became a recurring theme. A week turned into 2. 2 weeks became a month. Each delayed payment arrived with an explanation that sounded reasonable at the moment. A shipment held up, a client missed a deadline, an unexpected expense. Mark reminded himself that small businesses operate this way. Cash flow fluctuates. Everyone goes through minor setbacks. Yet, a small voice in his mind started asking questions he hadn't considered before. What if this pattern continues? What if the loan isn't as secure as I believed? At first, he ignored the warning signs. The late payments were minor compared to the total amount invested. $15,000 was a significant sum, but not enough to destabilize his life. He still had his savings, his paycheck, and the quiet reassurance that he was a careful, disciplined worker. The problem was that human psychology rarely recognizes slow erosion. When something deteriorates gradually, it appears harmless until the cumulative damage becomes undeniable. In Mark's case, each late payment, each small excuse, each reassured promise chipped away at what he thought was safety. 3 months after the initial loan, one of the promised payments never arrived. Another explanation followed. A client dispute, a supply chain issue, paperwork delays. Mark contacted his friend more directly this time. He needed a clear timeline, and he needed assurances. He received them, though they were vague, full of promises he wanted to believe. Mark's approach remained cautious, but hopeful. He began tracking the payments more closely, noting the dates they were supposed to arrive and the dates they actually did. He adjusted his personal budget to account for the missed funds, but by then the early warning signs had already begun to accumulate in ways he hadn't accounted for. Meanwhile, Mark noticed his own habits shifting. He started postponing discretionary spending more aggressively. Coffee trips were skipped, dining out became rare. Any minor luxury felt like an unnecessary risk. His focus on discipline and control grew, but it was applied defensively. He was trying to manage the consequences of a decision that had initially seemed low risk, and yet it was slowly taking over his life. 6 months in, the pattern became undeniable. 2/3 of the monthly payments were now late. Some arrived partially, others not at all. Every explanation sounded plausible at the moment, but looking at the sequence, it became clear. What he had assumed would be temporary was now systemic. Mark began asking for documentation, copies of invoices, client statements, anything that could verify the financial health of the business. Some documents came, others didn't. He began to realize that promises alone weren't a reliable measure of safety. Financially, the consequences were mounting. The portion of his savings tied up in the loan was no longer growing. Instead, it was stagnant, and in some months, the late or missing payments forced him to cover certain personal expenses from other reserves. Slowly, the buffer he had built for emergencies began to shrink. Emotionally, the toll was growing as well. Mark felt tension during every conversation, hesitation before checking his bank account, unease during nights when he reviewed his financial position. He began to see a clear pattern. The decision that had initially seemed harmless was quietly eroding both his savings and his peace of mind. By month 8, the full picture emerged. Only a fraction of the promised interest had arrived. The principal remained tied up in a system he no longer fully trusted. The business's cash flow had not improved as promised. Each conversation with his friend added small explanations, but no concrete resolution. Mark realized something he hadn't anticipated. The initial excitement over better returns had blinded him to the risks inherent in informal lending, the very qualities that had made the loan appear safe. Friendship, trust, written agreements were no guarantee of repayment. He started analyzing every step he had taken, every assumption, every reassurance he had accepted without question. Slowly, the hard truth became undeniable. A single, well-intentioned decision had begun to dismantle years of steady progress. He also noticed something subtle about himself. For months, he had believed he was managing risk carefully. In reality, he had underestimated it. He had relied on hope, trust, and surface-level information instead of insisting on rigorous verification and boundaries. By the 9th month, Mark faced a painful realization. He had no immediate way to recover the money. There was no sudden solution, no late-night strategy that could restore what was already compromised. The loss was partial, but real, and it was a consequence of the decision he had once thought harmless. At this stage, he stopped imagining miraculous recoveries. Instead, he began to understand the lesson embedded in the experience. Some decisions carry invisible weight. They may seem harmless in the moment, but over time, they can undermine stability and erode progress quietly, almost invisibly. The last payment of the 9th month never arrived. Mark contacted his friend one final time, seeking clarity. The explanation was again plausible, yet non-committal. He realized then that hoping for perfect outcomes was no longer realistic. By this point, the cumulative effect of the loan had reshaped his financial landscape. The safety net he had built over years of careful saving was compromised, leaving him more vulnerable than he had been before. It was a slow, silent lesson, but it was impossible to ignore. This was the stage where many people make a second mistake. They double down, chase quick recovery, or attempt high-risk strategies to regain what was lost. Mark considered the options, but he recognized that acting impulsively could worsen the situation. The decision had to be measured, even if it meant accepting the reality of the loss. In the quiet that followed, he began tracking the full consequences with disciplined clarity. Every late payment, every shortfall, every explanation was recorded. He had begun treating the situation not as a story of hope or potential gain, but as a case study in financial risk, a painful lesson that he could use to guide his decisions in the future. And so the second phase ended not with dramatic recovery, but with understanding. The problem was not over, but the lesson had begun to crystallize. Mark had recognized that some mistakes cannot be undone quickly. Some losses are permanent, but the knowledge gained can prevent repetition. By the 10th month, the situation had become undeniable. The remaining payments were inconsistent at best, missing entirely at worst. The principal he had loaned, $15,000, was partially intact, but its value was effectively diminished by months of delays and broken promises. Mark took a step back, reviewing the timeline in detail. Each payment that had arrived late or partially formed a clear pattern. What seemed temporary had turned structural. The business, despite assurances, did not generate the cash flow required to honor its obligations. Every short-term setback explanation now looked like a symptom of mismanagement rather than an isolated incident. For the first time, Mark allowed himself to feel the full emotional impact. He had spent years building a modest savings buffer, the very foundation that had allowed him to feel secure. That buffer was now compromised, not because of overspending or recklessness in his daily life, but because of one single decision that, in the moment, seemed rational. He reflected on the reasoning that had led him here: trust in a friend, reliance on surface-level assurances, and the belief that good intentions were enough to guarantee repayment had all combined to create a fragile system. Each assumption he had made, seemingly harmless at the time, now revealed itself as a risk multiplier. The consequences were tangible. With a portion of his savings tied up in the delayed and partially unpaid loan, Mark had less flexibility to handle unexpected personal expenses. Minor medical bills, car repairs, and other inevitable costs required him to pull from other accounts, further reducing the safety net he had worked so hard to build. Stress became a constant companion. Each day brought a reminder that his financial stability was more precarious than he had realized. Mark also recognized a psychological pattern. He had allowed optimism to override vigilance. Small successes, the initial on-time payments, had reinforced the belief that the system was secure. That confirmation bias prevented him from acting sooner, from demanding stricter accountability, from setting boundaries that could have minimized the damage. By month 11, the full picture was clear. The interest he had expected to earn was minimal, and the principal remained partially inaccessible. He had effectively traded a stable savings growth trajectory for a high-risk experiment with uneven returns. And unlike many financial lessons that are reversible with corrective action, the erosion of his security could not be instantly repaired. The realization was sobering. Financial mistakes rarely announce themselves with fireworks. More often, they creep quietly, disguised as reasonable decisions, until the accumulation of small errors becomes unavoidable. Mark understood that he had underestimated this subtle but dangerous reality. He began taking methodical steps, not to reverse the damage immediately because that was no longer possible, but to understand it fully, Every record, every communication, every transaction was reviewed and logged. He created a clear map of what had gone wrong, not to assign blame, but to identify lessons. Through this detailed review, Mark uncovered the core failures. The first was over-reliance on trust without sufficient verification. The second was underestimating systemic risk. Even well-intentioned friends or businesses can fail. The third was confirmation bias. Early signs of success had masked the underlying fragility of the arrangement. Mark's approach shifted from attempting rapid recovery to establishing preventive strategies for the future. He reinforced his other savings, diversified his assets, and committed to financial decisions that could be independently verified. While this could not undo the past, it offered a framework for avoiding repetition of the same mistake. The lesson extended beyond money. Mark recognized that emotional and social factors often influence financial decisions more than logical analysis. A friendly face, persuasive reasoning, or the desire to help someone could override careful planning. The combination of goodwill and poor verification had proven costly. By the 12th month, Mark accepted a simple but difficult truth. The loss was real, significant, and irreversible. He had not made reckless or careless choices in his daily life. He had made a single decision with underestimated risk that reshaped his financial reality. In those final weeks, he reflected deeply on how easily stability can be undermined. He realized that a secure financial foundation is not only built by saving diligently, but also protected by disciplined evaluation of every new opportunity, regardless of how reasonable it appears. Mark did not become a millionaire overnight. He did not recover the full amount lost. There was no dramatic turnaround. What he gained was far subtler: awareness, discipline, and understanding. He could explain it to someone else. He could write it down. He could teach. And that knowledge became a silent armor against future mistakes. The story was no longer about lost money. It was about the cost of a single decision when diligence is overlooked, and about the slow, patient recognition of risk that anyone with middle-class income could relate to. By the end of the year, the hard truth had settled in. Financial mistakes are rarely catastrophic in a single moment. They are often invisible as they begin, subtle as they grow, and only unmistakable once consequences manifest fully. Mark had lived this reality, painfully and slowly, and he would not forget it. For anyone watching this story, the message is clear. Some opportunities are not as harmless as they seem, and trust, even in the closest relationships, is not a substitute for verification. Stability is fragile, and the cost of a single decision can last far longer than the memory of the choice itself. This is not a story of triumph. It is a story of clarity, a reminder that careful observation, disciplined analysis, and realistic expectations are essential to protecting what you have worked for. Mark's experience leaves a simple, uncompromising lesson. Avoid decisions that seem harmless until you've fully assessed every risk. Sometimes, prevention matters far more than recovery. And that lesson, earned over 12 months of quiet erosion, remains more valuable than any amount of money could have been.